It's there somewhere. Okay, there we go. Okay. You got you had the previous one with the double screen format. That's it. Very nice to remind myself next. That's it. Thank you. Okay. Atrioventricular septal defect, I think we've now resolved pretty well. Although you notice that on occasions your surgical colleague who gave that excellent presentation would slip all the time into mitral valve. So you need to tell him it's not a mitral valve. It's never been a mitral valve. It can never become a mitral valve. That is the key to understanding. So double outlet right ventricle is probably more contentious and arguably still one of the most contentious entities. So what precisely is double outlet right ventricle? And again, I believe we should be using definitions that are immediately understandable. So what does double outlet right ventricle intuitively mean to you? Both arterial trunks are coming out of the right ventricle. So I think that if we resolve this question, we need to ask some specific questions. Is double outlet right ventricle in itself a phenotype? We've just spent the best part of 2 hours looking at atrioventricular septal defect, and we've emphasized the point that we recognize, you recognize, the echocardiographer recognizes atrioventricular septal defect because of one specific phenotype, namely the common atrioventricular junction. So is that also the case for double outlet right ventricle? Or is it in fact no more than one grouping together of hearts, a ventriculo-arterial connection? And is perhaps part of the controversy and the disagreement the fact that within this group that we put together because of the ventriculo-arterial connection, there are very many different specific phenotypes. And in fact, what I'd like to do is to persuade you that it is the latter that is true, and that we should be diagnosing double outlet right ventricle on the basis that it is a ventriculo-arterial connection. So let's look at what we can find within double outlet right ventricle. This is a very close-up part of the right ventricular outflow tract. You can see here the medial papillary muscle. You can see that this leaflet has attachments to the septal surface of the right ventricle. So that tells you it's a tricuspid valve, and this is the outflow tract of the tricuspid valve. And arising from it, you can see the aorta, and also arising from it, you can see there is the pulmonary trunk. There is a big block of muscle between the two, and that is the part that Dr. Deshpande was unable to show you in the normal heart, because she made the point that in the normal heart, the building blocks of the outflow tracts don't come apart. They only come apart in the setting of congenital cardiac malformation. So we're going to come back to this building block, which is labeled OS, and that stands for outlet septum. And then you can see that there is a completely muscular infundibulum supporting the leaflets of the aortic valve, and there is a completely muscular infundibulum supporting the leaflets of the pulmonary valve. And this particular heart is unusual because the ventricular septum is intact. So very rarely you can find double outlet right ventricle with intact ventricular septum. Other times, however, you find double out, or at least in the majority of cases, you find double outlet right ventricle with an interventricular communication. But this is another very unusual type of double outlet right ventricle with interventricular communication. Because again, you see the aorta with a subaortic infundibulum. You see the pulmonary trunk with a subpulmonary infundibulum. And there is an interventricular communication, but it is opening to the inlet of the right ventricle. And we presume that initially there had been another communication there, but it is closed. So totally different phenotype, double outlet right ventricle with muscular interventricular communication. Now, nobody is going to doubt the fact that these hearts have double outlet right ventricle, because not only are both arterial trunks obviously arising from the right ventricle, each of the arterial valves is supported by a completely muscular infundibulum. And it is that point that has created the problems in the diagnosis of double outlet right ventricle. So here I'm showing you another heart in which you're looking at the outflow tract of the morphologically right ventricle. And you can see two arterial trunks. That one is the aorta, and that one is the pulmonary trunk. This time, you can see that there is a grossly restrictive interventricular communication. But if you look very carefully at the roof of that interventricular communication, you see there is fibrous continuity between the leaflets of the aortic and mitral valves. And some people would try to tell you that this is not double outlet right ventricle because it doesn't have bilateral infundibulums. But as you can see, the entirety of the aortic root arises from the right ventricle. The entirety of the pulmonary root arises from the right ventricle. So anybody who tries to tell me this is double outlet right ventricle is talking nonsense. And so what I'll come back to is the significance of bilateral infundibulums in the setting of double outlet right ventricle. But what I've shown you already is that there is no specific phenotype, but that all of the hearts that I've shown you can be grouped together because the ventricular outflow tracts are supported by the morphologically right ventricle. Now, in all the ones that I've shown you thus far, that would not be a question. In two, because the septum was virtually intact. In the third, even though there was aortic to mitral fibrous continuity, there was a grossly restrictive interventricular communication. So you could clearly see that both arterial trunks were arising from the chamber. So the ongoing controversies are the presence or absence of bilateral conuses, and that is because of the relationship with tetralogy of Fallot. But there is another potential controversy that I think is particularly important to you as you make the diagnosis. And what I'm going to show you is we can turn this third controversy to our advantage when we are looking for an appropriate definition of double outlet right ventricle. And that is the name for the channel between the ventricles. Now you may justifiably say, what's in a name? And indeed, that is a paper that Becker and I wrote many years ago when we first described atrioventricular septal defect. And we asked the question, would a rose by any other name smell as sweet? I'll come back to that in the setting of double outlet right ventricle, because I think the understanding of what we're going to call these channels helps you to understand the entity in itself. But let's get rid of the easy one. Is the presence of bilateral conuses an essential part of the diagnosis? I am sure that some of you in this room have been taught that you only diagnose double outlet on the basis of bilateral conuses, and that is a nonsense. Because we know that both arterial trunks can arise from the right ventricle when there is fibrous continuity. I've just shown you that. Equally significantly, hearts with either concordant or discordant ventricular arterial connections can exist with bilateral conuses. So we come back to the anatomic principle that resolves all this, and it is once more the morphological method. As I've pointed out, the morphological method was instituted by Dr. Van Praag and his colleagues, and they said we should not use one feature, which is variable, to describe another variable feature. Instead, we should define features according to their intrinsic morphology. And so when we think of infundibular morphology, that is but one of the variants that we see in double outlet right ventricle, but we see the same variations in transposition, rarely in the otherwise normal heart. So I'm showing you here the picture of an outflow tract in a heart from a patient who has transposition. So the ventricle that you see here is the morphologically left ventricle, and what you see there arising from it is the pulmonary trunk. The aorta in this heart is arising from the right ventricle. So you are all going to call this transposition, are you not? Discordant ventriculo-arterial connections. The fact that there are bilateral infundibulums does not stop you calling this transposition. And I hope there is no one in the room who would want to call this double outlet right ventricle just because there are bilateral conuses. So what about tetralogy of Fallot? That's probably a bigger bugbear at the moment than is the feature of bilateral conuses. I'll come back to the major point I've been trying to make thus far. I think we should define double outlet on the basis of a ventricular arterial connection, and I'm hoping I can persuade you of that fact. The initial question I asked you was whether double outlet right ventricle was a specific phenotype, and I showed you that it wasn't. But tetralogy of Fallot for sure is a specific phenotype. So here you have one thing that is not a phenotype, here you have another thing that is a phenotype, and the two can coexist. So depending upon the degree of the overriding aortic root, tetralogy of Fallot can be found with concordant ventricular arterial connections when the larger part of the aorta is supported by the morphologically right ventricle, or with double outlet ventricular arterial connections when all of the pulmonary trunk and most of the aorta is supported by the right ventricle. So now we get to the real crux of the problem. All the questions I've been putting to you thus far devolve on this one single potential problem. How do we deal with overriding of arterial valves? I was asked a question this morning about straddling of atrioventricular valves. And I discussed with you how in atrioventricular valves you can have straddling and overriding. With arterial valves, the leaflets can only override because they have no tension apparatus. But the override can vary markedly. And so, what we have to distinguish in the setting of overriding valves is the situation in which, despite the override, there are still outlets from both ventricles, or whether the override is sufficient that it seems that both outlets are coming from the same ventricle. And obviously there is a spectrum between these extremes. You also were told this morning about the spectrum of chamber dominance in atrioventricular septal defect. And the point was made very nicely that you divide the spectrum of chamber dominance at its midpoint. And that is exactly what we do with overriding valves. Now that in itself has also been controversial, because those who wanted to retain the notion of bilateral conuses as the defining feature of double outlet said that you could take an echocardiographic probe and according to the long axis of the ventricular septum, you could turn the same heart into double outlet or concordant connections. And that is because the degree of override should not be determined on the long axis of the ventricular mass. The degree of override depends on what is happening in the short axis. And it is true that during the cardiac cycle, the long axis plane of the ventricular septum can change so that it seems to be AA, and in this situation you would give the overriding arterial valve to the left ventricle, and then during the cardiac cycle, the septum may shift, so it would seem that for sure the arterial valve is coming from the left ventricle, and it can go the other way. But that misses the point, because we do not determine the degree of override according to the long axis. We determine it according to the short axis, because the degree of override depends on the way the cord of the ventricular septum cuts the overriding arterial route. And so if I show you the normal heart, as you would view it looking from the ventricular apex towards the ventricular base, there is another constraining feature, and that is that the aortic root itself seems to override the crest of the muscular ventricular septum. But in the normal heart, the arterial valvar leaflets are exclusively connected within the left ventricle. So we cannot determine override on the basis of the normal attachments of the aortic valve. So this is what it looks like when I take a picture photographing the aortic root from above. You're looking down this time. So this is the front, this is the back, this is the right side, this is the left side. And that is the right coronary sinus of the aorta. And what you now see when you look at the sinus, when you look at the hinge of the aortic valve, it is not the valvar orifice that is overriding the ventricular septum, it is the aortic valvar sinus. And all of these potential controversies are now resolved by computed tomography. I'm going to say a little more about computed tomography later this afternoon, and I've already mentioned it in my preliminary comments this morning. Multi-detector computed tomography has revolutionized the understanding of cardiac anatomy. One of the best protagonists of computed tomography in the United States of America with regard to pediatric cardiology is Dr. Tony Levarchek. And Tony Levarchek works at Medical University of South Carolina. And Tony Levarchek has produced these exquisite pictures that I'm going to use for the next few minutes. So here now you're looking down on the outflow tracts, and you'll recognize, I hope, the aorta, and you'll see that the infundibulum is at right angles to the aorta as it spirals round to reach the ventricular outflow tract. And this is from a patient who has a ventricular septal defect. But what Tony is showing you is the plane of the ventricular septum versus the circumference of the aortic root. And so looking down in this way, there is no question but that in this patient, The larger part of the aorta is supported by the left ventricle, so confidently we can say that this patient has concordant atrioventricular connections. All comfortable with that? All understand the image? We can do even better than that when we have tetralogy of Fallot. Is that not an exquisite picture? That shows you the precise degree of override of the aortic root. Nothing to do with the change in the long axis of the section. If you wanted to, you could take a tape measure and you work out precisely how much of the aortic root was supported by the right ventricle, how much was supported by the left ventricle. As I eyeball this picture, I think it's about 50-50. So if it's 50-50, I'm going to err on the side of normality, and I'm going to give this aortic root to the left ventricle, and I'm going to say here that there is concordant ventriculo-arterial connections. All comfortable with that? So let's look at one more heart. Again, another of Tony's exquisite computed tomograms. You are above the heart, you're looking down onto the crest of the ventricular septum. This is the left atrium. There you see the pectinate muscles in the left atrial appendage. This is all the right atrium. There is the aortic root, and there is the pulmonary root. And what you clearly see is the plane of the ventricular septum, and I can take the chord of that ventricular septum, I can relate it relative to the aortic root. Which ventricle does the aorta belong to this time? The right ventricle, unequivocally. Despite the fact that here we have a little bit of override with the aorta still supported by the left ventricle, this is double outlet right ventricle. So, we can do away with the controversies of aortic overriding if we have access to computed tomography. But what we saw this morning here at Kogelabend, you have three-dimensional echocardiography. Your three-dimensional echocardiograms shown this morning were spectacular. So you should be able to exactly the same as this, but with three-dimensional echo. So, double outlet right ventricle. Double outlet right ventricle is a ventricular arterial connection. It does not need bilateral conuses, and we determine overriding according to the short axis of the arterial root. So let's now get to perhaps the clinically most important feature of double outlet, because all of those things I've just talked about are not going to change what happens to the patient. What may well change what happens to the patient is how you deal with the channel between the ventricles. And I use my words very carefully here. Maurice Lev, way back in 1972, was the man who pointed to the best way of categorizing this channel between the ventricles. In his paper of 1972, they said it could be subaortic, subpulmonary, doubly committed, non-committed. But at the time, Maurice Lev was calling that channel between the ventricles a ventricular septal defect. Now we have another problem here, because thanks to my forebears, you all in this room speak English, and that's because you were, in the days gone by, we had Independence Day yesterday, so for quite some time now, for most of you in this room, you were probably born long after independence, so you never knew the bad old days when Britishers like I would come and rule you all and rule the roost. So, for better or worse, like me, you call a channel between the ventricles a ventricular septal defect. The continentals, the Italians, the Spaniards, the French, the Portuguese, they are much more beautiful. They use their words and they call it a communication interventriculaire. And that's much more flamboyant than calling it a ventricular septal defect, which is the crude way that the Anglo-Saxons describe it. But could it be that there is a difference between a communication interventriculaire and a ventricular septal defect? And could it be that the channel that you call the ventricular septal defect in double outlet is not the same channel as the one you call in the patient who has concordant ventricular arterial connections? So let me take you through this by looking at tetralogy of Fallot. And let me go back again to the exquisite computed tomograms produced by Tony Levarchek. Could you wish to see a better picture of the phenotypic morphology of tetralogy of Fallot than this parasternal cut showing you the infundibular morphology that gives us the phenotype of tetralogy? Does everybody intuitively understand the picture? Isn't it beautiful? So what we are looking at here, for those of you who still need a little bit of help, there is the right ventricle, and here is the aorta. And clearly the aortic root is overriding the crest of the muscular ventricular septum. Tony has cut through the long axis of the pulmonary trunk, and again you can see the pulmonary trunk is essentially at right angles to the aorta. But what Tony's computed tomogram shows you exquisitely is the anterocephalad malalignment of the outlet septum. And that then shows you the squeeze between the malaligned outlet septum and the parietal part of the ventricle, the narrowed subpulmonary infundibulum that is the essential phenotype of tetralogy of Fallot. Are you all comfortable with that? I'm now going to put in some arrows. Now that arrow, I hope you will all agree with me, is what we're going to call the ventricular septal defect. Everybody agree with that? That is where you are going to ask your surgeon to place the patch so as to put the aorta back in the left ventricle. All still with me? No dissenting voices. Okay, the beauty of having this computed tomographic data set is we can take exactly the same thing and we can cut it in any plane we want. Exactly the same patient. Tony has turned his cutting plane so he's looking at the 4-chamber plus aortic root, or the 5-chamber view, replicating the echocardiogram. Everybody understand the picture? Okay, there is the long axis of the ventricular septum. Now this time it is important that we continue the long axis of the ventricular septum. Because if I continue the plane of the ventricular septum, that is the plane that separates what is right ventricular from what is left ventricular. It is the geometric interventricular communication. Would you all agree with me there? Nobody is ever going to call that the ventricular septal defect. No surgeon is ever going to put a patch in that position. Correct? So, we have a second plane. And that is the plane that just a moment ago you agreed with me was called the ventricular septal defect. All happy with that still? That is what you are going to define in your echocardiography, and that's where you're going to tell the surgeon to put his patch. Yes? There is yet another plane. And would you all agree with me that that double-headed red arrow marks the outflow tract for the left ventricle? Yes? Would any of you call that double-headed red arrow which is the outflow tract for the left ventricle, would any of you call that the ventricular septal defect? No, thank you. Look at the margins of this, because it extends from the crest of the ventricular septum to this point, which is the inner heart curvature. That is where the heart tube bent back on itself. So let's look at the interventricular communication, and let's consider the situation in the Tausig-Bing malformation. Pradeep doesn't have Tausig-Bing hearts to me, but this is the transposition variant of double outlet, but I'm showing you the situation where the pulmonary trunk arises exclusively from the left ventricle. And I'm sticking with Tony's exquisite computed tomograms. This time I'm showing you a frontal section through the heart, and I've put in the labels so that there can be no mistake. Left ventricle, right ventricle, pulmonary trunk, aorta. Are you all comfortable that both the aorta and the pulmonary trunk arise predominantly from the right ventricle? So we have double outlet right ventricle, and we have a subpulmonary channel between the ventricles. So there is the long axis of the ventricular septum, and there is the channel between the ventricles. It is between the crest of the ventricular septum and the inner heart curvature. Are you all going to call that the ventricular septal defect? But is it analogous to the ventricular septal defect you just described to me in tetralogy of Fallot? The double-headed red arrow here is still the outflow tract for the left ventricle. Are you going to ask the surgeon to close that ventricular septal defect? Exactly, not unless the specimen is going to come to me. It is a nonsense to call that double-headed red arrow the ventricular septal defect. There is the muscular outlet septum, and what you are going to ask the surgeon to do is to place a patch in exactly the same place as you would ask him to in tetralogy of Fallot. And what did you call that double-headed white arrow in tetralogy of Fallot? No, what did you call the plane of space that is marked by the two ends of those yellow double-headed arrow? VSD. Exactly. So if you call that plane of space the VSD in tetralogy of Fallot, why shouldn't you call that the VSD in double outlet right ventricle? So I give you a pragmatic definition for double outlet right ventricle. If you are able to ask your surgeons, if you are able to say to them, I've got this patient, I'd like you to go in and I'd like you to close the ventricular septal defect, then intuitively you have made the decision that the patient has either concordant or discordant ventricular arterial connections. Because just 2 minutes ago, you agreed with me that you would never ask the surgeon to close the ventricular septal defect in double outlet right ventricle. So if instead you go to the surgeon and you say, I've got this patient, and what I'd like you to do is to create a tunnel so that the channel between the ventricles goes either into the aorta, into the pulmonary trunk, then you have made the decision that that patient has double outlet right ventricle. So there is the solution to all the problems I've been posing to you. So the interventricular communication, I'm not going to call it a ventricular septal defect anymore. I know that as soon as I get on the plane on Monday and I head out to Vizag, you'll all start calling it a ventricular septal defect again. And I'm going to give this talk, I think, or I might not have done, but I've given it before, but if I gave this talk in Vizag, all the surgeons would listen to me there and they'd say, what a great talk. and then I'd get off the plane and I'd go to New Delhi, and they'd still call it ventricular septal defect. We have to be logical, and you have to think outside the box, and you have to take on board the things that are easier to understand. Snehal asked me, make things easy to understand. The understanding comes from distinguishing between what you call an interventricular communication and what you call a ventricular septal defect. Having defined the interventricular communication, which is how the blood gets out of the left ventricle, you then want to know where it's going to. So what determines the location of the defect? And it is what Dr. Deshpande showed you this morning and emphasized to you this morning. It is an understanding of the building blocks of the outflow tract, the definition of muscle bundles. And we need to define the outlet septum, and the outlet septum is anything that separates the subpulmonary and subaortic outlets. The ventricular infundibular fold, she showed you this morning, separates the leaflets of atrioventricular and arterial valves. And the septomarginal trabeculation, or the septal band, which again she showed you, is the septal muscle bundle of the right ventricle. So we can look at those muscle bundles in this fascinating heart, which in fact is tetralogy of Fallot with bilateral infundibulums. How do I know that is the outlet septum? Because it separates the outflow tracts. And in double outlet, it is that big block of muscle. How do I know that is the ventricular infundibular fold? Because it separates the tricuspid valve from the aortic valve, and it runs all the way across, and it also separates the mitral valve from the aortic valve. And that is the septomarginal trabeculation. And now you can see all of these things with computed tomography. And that shows you precisely where the interventricular communication is positioned. And we now see that it is the attachment of the muscular outlet septum to the apical septum that puts the intercommunication in subaortic position, in this instance with a persistent ventricular infundibular fold between the aortic valve, the tricuspid valve, the defect opening between the limbs of the septomarginal trabeculation. And that's what I can show you in the images. So here, both arterial trunks with infundibulums, subaortic, subpulmonary. There is the interventricular communication, opening between the limbs of the septomarginal trabeculation, opening in subaortic position, because the outlet septum is attached to the cranial limb of the septomarginal trabeculation. And there, the subaortic tunnel that the surgeon will put a patch over so as to connect the aorta with the left ventricle. Note, however, there is fibrous continuity between the leaflets of the tricuspid and mitral valves, and that makes the defect perimembranous. Just to emphasize, we don't have to have bilateral conuses. So this is a subaortic defect with aortic to mitral fibrous continuity. There you see the valvar continuity, still opening between the limbs of the septomarginal trabeculation because the muscular outlet septum is attached to the cranial margin of the septomarginal trabeculation, putting the defect in subaortic position. It is the subpulmonary defect that is the essence of the Taussig-Bing malformation, here with bilateral infundibulums. And the defect is in subpulmonary position because the muscular outlet septum is now attached to the caudal limb of the septomarginal trabeculation, thus putting the defect into subpulmonary position. It still, however, opens between the limbs of the septomarginal trabeculation. And it too can exist between the limbs of the septomarginal trabeculation when there is fibrous continuity between the leaflets of the pulmonary valve, but now it is pulmonary to mitral fibrous continuity, again because the outlet septum is attached to the anterocephalad limb of the septomarginal trabeculation. We can then have situations in which the outlet septum is fibrous rather than muscular, and I call this a doubly committed defect. But in fact, it's probably better to call it a subaortic defect because the fibrous outlet septum is still attached to the cranial margin of the septomarginal trabeculation, so that here, realistically, the defect remains subaortic even though there's a fibrous outlet septum. It is the non-committed defects that give equal problems in definition. In this one with very long infundibulums, is that defect subpulmonary or is it non-committed? The surgeon would readily place a patch in that direction, do an arterial switch, and achieve biventricular repair. It is this heart that truly has the non-committed defect, and I've shown you this before. So the building blocks are the key to understanding the surgical danger areas. I'm showing you the situation with a subaortic defect. The outlet septum is safe. You can resect the outlet septum because it never carries conduction tissue, providing you avoid the first septal perforating artery and providing you avoid the leaflets of the arterial valves. The body of the septomarginal trabeculation is safe, but again, if you dissect in the anterocranial limb, you may well find the first septal perforating artery. It is the posterior limb that is at major danger because it is adjacent to the conduction axis. And the adjacency of the conduction axis depends exclusively on whether or not there's arterial to tricuspid fibrous continuity. If there is a muscular posterior inferior rim, it will protect the conduction axis, and it is the ventricular infundibular fold that forms that rim. There's never any conduction tissue there, but be careful, because if the surgeon goes through that rim, he goes outside the heart, and lying here in the inner heart curvature, we have the coronary arteries. So if I put everything together, double outlet right ventricle is not an entity in itself. It is a group of lesions that we put together simply because they have the same ventriculo-arterial connection. The most important aspect is the channel between the ventricles, and I hope you will recognize that it is an interventricular communication, even though you're going to call it a ventricular septal defect. And don't forget the other lesions that I haven't really had time to talk about. So I didn't want to take too much time because we have some beautiful hearts to demonstrate to you. So I'll walk over now and we'll look at what we have from the specimen point of view.